Tom Woods, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Kim, I couldn't be happier. Thanks so much.
Diary of a Psychosis, how public health disgraced itself during COVID mania. A lot of us want to move on from COVID and not think about it ever again. But we kind of have to, honestly, because I don't think we corrected the problems. I don't think a lot of people understand why there was this massive psychosis that happened, what drew them into it personally, and how we could prevent it from ever happening again. That would be
Well,
my thinking on this.
yeah, so I can't imagine the idea that we should just set this aside and move on. Could you imagine Thomas Jefferson saying, "If the government ever perpetrates an atrocity against you, just move on"? I mean, it just never occurred to him to talk that way. And I
Right.
also feel like, how's that worked for us before in the past? The Iraq War turned out to be a humanitarian catastrophe for no good reason. Nobody was fired. We just, quote unquote, moved on. It seems like we always do that. There's some,
Yeah.
especially in foreign policy, there are all kinds of atrocities going on in our name. And every blankety blank time, we just, quote unquote, move on. Well, you know what? I don't want to move on anymore. I want a reckoning of what was done, particularly because even though a lot of us now realize, and realized at the time, that what was asked of us was unreasonable, irrational, unscientific, and tyrannical, there are hundreds of millions, if not likely billions of people around the world who still think that what happened was public health officials did their very best under trying
Right.
circumstances to help us out. If we let that become the conventional wisdom of what happened over those several years, then we're going to deserve what happens to us next.
Yeah. It is. Right. Just to say, well, everybody had the best intentions. I mean, but I think some people did. I mean, I think that there was just a lot of, I think a lot of people, maybe even most people, were genuinely just afraid and just genuinely wanted to avoid what they were afraid of in their mind, which was like absolute catastrophe, killing grandma, one third of the people dropping dead. There was like a lot of massive fear around COVID, thanks much to the media that they had a lot to do with it. The death tickers that we saw on Fox News and CNN, right? They were just really feeding into that public hysteria. So I think a lot of people did have decent intentions, but maybe some others didn't, right? And they were like the vaccine makers who were pushing mandates and wanting everybody to take the jab, even when they knew from the studies that it wasn't doing the thing that they were making the public believe they would do, like stop the spread.
Well, for some of them, it was a matter of they were just allergic to data. I can understand people in January, February, and especially March thinking, I'm going to wait and see. I don't know what to do. Maybe I'll cancel my kid's birthday party and wait and see. But
Yeah.
this went way beyond that. We had an avalanche of evidence that the stay at home orders and all this stuff hadn't done anything. We had Google data, mobility data showing no correlation between people moving around and health outcomes like that. And then I can't remember if it was the New York Times, I think it was the Washington Post, did a survey of epidemiologists. Now, before this whole thing, I thought epidemiologists were practitioners of a real science. Like this was a real field, the study of disease and its spread. And now they seem like crazy hypochondriacs to me, most of them. Because when the Washington Post did a survey of them, it was asking, which of the following things are you willing to do under the present circumstances? This was 3, 4, 5, 6 months in, and they weren't willing to do any of them. And even again, like half a year in, 17% of epidemiologists were afraid to check their mail because they thought COVID was on the mail or something. I mean, what? There's something wrong with that. Like that, you have to be willfully in defiance of the evidence there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can absolutely sympathize with people who are facing the unknown and they don't know what to do. But as the charts and graphs came out showing you can't tell the difference between this county in Tennessee that shut the restaurants down and this one that didn't, then
Yeah.
we should have rethought the whole thing.
There is something very, very, very powerful about the emotions around COVID. Maybe the fear. Fear is just, I think, an incredibly powerful motivator. It seems, and it just overrides logic. I wish somebody would, like the science. They're not going to because they don't want to admit that they themselves are like weak in this way. But just they the fear just even the smartest people I knew, like you said, being allergic to data, it was just like the fear repelled it. They just could not look at the data. They couldn't see the data. They were blinded by this fear. And that motivator fear is, that when people are afraid, they've committed the greatest atrocities ever known to man with under the guise of fear.
Well, fear, and then combine that with the moralizing tale that we were told, which was states are going to do well if they follow our public health guidance.
Right.
But they're going to do very badly if they don't. And those are the bad states. And so when you view things through that moralizing lens, it becomes very hard to look at the situation rationally. Because if that were true, that if people just adjust their behavior according to the public health guidelines, if that were true, the world would look a lot different than it actually did.
Yeah.
Because if you look at, like, for example, out in the West Coast, you had California heavily locked down. You had Arizona, which was more open, and Nevada was somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were periods of time you put charts up and you look at how are deaths going, in terms of COVID and all that, and how are the hospitalizations, and they're basically identical. I mean, you just can't tell, and that shouldn't have happened. That shouldn't have been possible. So, in Diary of a Psychosis, I follow, day by day everything that's going on, and I got a lot of details in there. But I feel like there really are only two things you absolutely have to know, and that if you know them, you can win any argument that you're having about this. And the first one is from right here in the U.S. I live in Florida, thank God. We moved here in 2016, not knowing our good fortune at the time.
I'm stuck in California, so in Los Angeles, of all places.
I mean, it was awful. I mean, I have 5 daughters, and the good thing about Ron DeSantis is that they were able to live somewhat normally during that time, and and they didn't have to have their little hearts broken because everything was canceled and abolished. Well, in California, the kind of policies they had there. I brought one of my daughters to a quick trip to California in 2021, and the public health people had said that, so we went to a drive-in movie, and we thought, that's allowed. You're in your car. You're not going to get COVID. But the public health department had declared no double features. Now, but 2 times 0 is still 0, So anyway, so the first of the facts is that when all was said and done, and especially when we adjust for age, because we all know everybody goes to Florida to retire, whereas California is one of the youngest states in the union, and we know there's a 1,000-fold mortality difference. So what do we find? We find that in terms of excess deaths, which that's the statistic we care about. This COVID death thing is very, very murky about how they code it. Plus, it leaves out the deaths by lockdown, the deaths by missed surgeries, and things like that. So if you just look at excess deaths, how did Florida end up doing better? If we asked in March 2020, all the hysterics, if we have Florida pretty well open and California closed, which one you think is going to do better? They say, well, obviously California, but it's not. And so that means they were wrong. Like, there's no answer to that. There's not one of them would have said, well, we'll just have to wait and see. And the second statistic, of course, involves the country they all hated, which was Sweden. And because Sweden didn't have a proper lockdown. And the thing is, you would expect humane people to say something like, well, Sweden is taking a risk here, and let's cross our fingers that it works out for them. That wasn't how they talked. It was Sweden's going to get what's coming to them for not listening to... And yet, when all was said and done, you look at all the European countries, and who did the best when it came to excess deaths? It was Sweden. And there has hardly been a single apology. So those two things, again, if you had asked them in March 2020, if Sweden doesn't do these things, do you think it'll have the best numbers in terms of excess deaths? They would have laughed at you.
Yeah, one thing about Sweden. So Sweden was an interesting case. I remember this. Really, those who were absolutely pro-lockdown, pro-mandates, pro all of the measures that these public health people were putting on us and advocating for those, they absolutely demonized Sweden and said Sweden was like the worst place on earth. These were the same people a lot of times, especially like the progressive leftists who really...
They love Sweden.
Right? They loved Sweden prior to COVID, right?
Yeah.
Sweden with their, heavy social programs, is social democracy. A lot of progressives wanted a government similar to Sweden. I really like the Swedish style of government. That's my preferred style, especially during COVID. And then I thought, yes, here is a government that says we are a democracy. So therefore, we cannot lock people down. That is wrong. in a democracy, we do not do these types of things. They held to their principles of being a Western democracy, of caring about people and letting people make their own decisions and not being tyrannical dictators. And the progressive left in particular just went absolutely bonkers over Sweden and just saying, oh, this is a libertarian country. A libertarian's dream is what they were saying. And it was when it came to COVID, I suppose, right? Just on
Yeah.
this one issue. But, Anders Tegnell, the epidemiologist who was in charge of the Swedish response, said over and over, he says, we won't know for 3 years. Like, it'll be about 3 years before we see who's right and who's wrong. So we'll wait and see. And of course, during that news cycle, I remember in that when Sweden was not choosing to lock down, they made all the news. Everyone was talking about Sweden. But of course, 3 years later, no one's talking about Sweden. And they're
Right.
particularly not talking about Sweden for the reason that you mentioned, because Sweden actually outperformed everybody. In the end, it turned out, because then in the beginning, I remember they were saying, no, Sweden's not doing as well. Look at them compared to Denmark.
Right.
Denmark is doing great, right? They're like, Denmark has a low, and then suddenly Denmark got it. I mean, Denmark went crazy with the virus and ended up surging all around the country and ultimately got hit and performed worse than Sweden in the end, 3 years later.
You mentioned Tegnell, whose policy this largely was, and it boggles my mind the strength of character you would have had to stand up against the public health establishment of the entire world, knowing full well you won't be vindicated for 3 years. That is a heroic position to take. I mean, I don't know if I would have had the strength to do that, but he did it. And doggone it, he was vindicated. Nobody knows about it, of course, because they make documentaries about Anthony Fauci, not about him.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. But he was right. I mean, there ended up being some pressure in Sweden. The politics did get to it, and they tried to change the laws to where the scientists couldn't actually be 100% in charge of a scientific response. They wanted the politicians to be in charge because fear again, the population started to feel fear. And they wanted to make some change and they wanted to behave. And just like you said with, these people that should have had a humane response and said, well, let's hope the best. Like, we'll see. Hopefully these people survive. Instead, they were like chanting and cheering on the death of Swedes. That's what fear does. Fear will turn normally good people into tyrannical, terrible human beings. I mean, that's how we ended up with like the Holocaust in World War II, was like fear of a certain group of people. This is how genocides happen. This is how wars happen. This is how the worst of the worst things happen, is because a group of people says, but that group, we're afraid of what that group is going to do. So we have to then chant for their death and bring on their death even.
They did something very, very similar even earlier than the attack on Sweden in the way Japan was treated in the international press, because Japan had a lackluster lockdown and they weren't really doing any of this stuff. They certainly weren't doing the obsessive testing that you saw in South Korea and that was being advocated here. So there are newspaper headlines of, Japan's half-hearted lockdown, too little, too late. And not even the humility to have a question mark at the end, like too little, too late. No, they just know Japan's going to get what's coming to them. And so, again, Japan ended up having excellent results, even though they had a very old population. I mean, demographically, they have an older population. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. They were all, again, it's like they were licking their chops that Tokyo's going to get what's coming to it. And then when that didn't happen, they did two things. Usually they just ignored Japan at that point. That was the thing. Just don't talk about it anymore. Never, ever admit we just don't understand what's going on. That you can't do. You're not allowed to admit that. But the other thing was then after the fact, they started to say, oh, you know what? We figured it out. We figured out why Japan did so well. It's because they wore masks. But the thing is, they already knew Japan wore masks at the time. And I had a guy on my show. Now his name is escaping me, but that's a good thing. It was establishment guy, who said that the reason that Japan did so well was that the government supplied them with masks. The government sent out 50 million masks, and that's what did it. What he doesn't know, because he just doesn't bother to look, is that those masks were a national joke in Japan because they were all too small. And people got them in the mail, they couldn't fit them on. And meanwhile, we got this high-profile guy in the U.S. insisting that must be the explanation. And then we would get these stories about masks solved the problem in the Czech Republic, because look at the numbers, and masks solved the problem here and there. But then when the mask practice continued at the same rate, but the numbers would shoot up, there would be no follow-up stories saying, well, gee, masks don't seem to solve the problem now, so maybe we were wrong the first time. Never.
Right.
And in fact, one of my favorite examples is Iowa and New Mexico. And you think, Woods, how do you possibly know a comparison between Iowa and New Mexico? Because I was obsessed with this for several years. I followed it all very closely. So Iowa and New Mexico, like a lot of states, had a graph where, the numbers went up and then they came back down. But the difference in how the two states were treated was they didn't wait to write an article about New Mexico until its numbers came down. And we started to read reports about here's how New Mexico brought science into the fight against COVID. Iowa has exactly the same curve, but while their numbers are in the process of going up, we get this story about Iowa, Washington Post, or could have been the Atlantic, Iowa, the state that doesn't care if you live or die. And then their numbers go down exactly like New Mexico, but do they get a story about how science helped to solve it in Iowa? Of course not, because they want the story of the stupid rubes wouldn't listen to the scientists, and that's why they died, and the smart people with PhDs did listen. And it's just like you're pulling your hair out. But I will say that I hate to say there's a silver lining to this horrible atrocity, but I am a silver lining seeking sort of guy. And one silver lining is that it did wake up a lot of people to realize that maybe the people trotted out and positioned as experts, maybe they're not as expert as you think. And so one of the at least local heroes who came out of this is a woman from Ohio, a lay woman but very sharp, named Catherine Hewig. And she went to the Ohio State House and did something I only wish I had the opportunity to do. She brought a chart with her, a chart of COVID deaths over time in Ohio. But she didn't put the months in, so you don't know what segment of time this is. You just see the chart going up and down. And she said to the legislators, now look, you've disrupted everybody's lives. You've endangered their health, their well-being, their life savings, their occupation, their mental health. All these things you've done. You've split families against each other. So the things you recommended darn well better be evident on this graph. Like the moment you instituted statewide masking, it better be obvious on this graph. We better see the numbers falling way down. Or when we all met for Thanksgiving, there better be a huge spike a couple weeks after that. Or you guys were witch doctors who owe us an apology, to put it mildly. And so she said to them, she challenged them. Now notice on the x-axis I haven't indicated the time, because you're going to tell me, because it's going to be obvious from the chart, right? I want you to tell me, when's Thanksgiving on this chart? Silence. When did we start masking? Silence. Because it's all random. It was all random. And she just stuck it right in their faces. And that was what we needed more of. So now I think we now have at least a chunk of the American population that now is skeptical of official voices. And as you know from the kind of topics you cover on your show, Americans could stand to have a tiny, itsy-bitsy bit more skepticism toward official voices.